Well, thank you for joining Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones, and we are continuing our study through the Daodejing. And today we are on chapter 28. So let me go ahead and, all right. Well, this is an interesting chapter. It's going to pull together a lot in a very condensed and concise way. So I think we'll just kind of jump in and work through some of the details on this. So it starts with know the male and maintain the female. Become the channel of the world. Now, a couple of different ways this channel of the world has been translated. Could be something like a mountain stream or a forge or something where you have kind of like this large waterway is what's kind of in mind here. So we've had a chance to talk about a number of different things for those of you that have been participating in this for a little while. What do you suppose is happening here with that first line? Know the male and maintain the female. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think like the male traits, we've been talking about the male traits and female traits, and I think what it's saying is know the male traits, but also like use the female traits too. Like don't be too much of one or the other.
What's one of the principal ways that that's talked about in terms of kind of balancing these two out? More like a symbol.
The yin, I don't want to say it wrong, but the yin yang, yin yang.
Yin yang, yes. Don't worry about mispronouncing Chinese words or characters. I have a horrible time with it myself. Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, we've got this idea of these two concepts of male and female that we are being encouraged to approach here in a certain way. And it's saying, know the male, maintain the female. Do you pick up on any distinction between where the emphasis is placed? Or do you sense that there's any emphasis?
Seems to give the impression that the female essence is primary and the male essence is derivative. So it's kind of like femaleness is the default, and we kind of explore the qualities of maleness, but without while still maintaining the qualities of femaleness underneath.
Mm-hmm.
Also, wasn't there something about the valley spirit? And, its female nature.
Yeah, the exactly. Chapter 6 it definitely gets into this.
The valley, sort of like the channel.
Very similar, right? So you've got the idea of low places, places where water gathers, and water, of course, is a big metaphor for the idea of Tao because of the way that it flows and it adapts and it doesn't contend. So you're definitely right in bringing together this idea of like this mountain, river, or channel or whatnot, waterway is definitely bringing in those elements as well. And this will get picked up even a little bit further, further in the text here. So a little bit of historical context again, if we think about why and when this is being written, during that Warring States period in China, where you have, kind of a social breakdown that's happening and all the different groupings of the states are vying for power and fighting with each other again for a period of about 200 years. Everybody's coming up with these ideas of how do we get out of this mess? And each of them is called a Tao. And so this would be one of the offerings among many. Of course, Confucius would be another primary one that has survived, but there was so many that they refer to it as the 100 schools of thought. And this was definitely the golden age of philosophy for China. So when we think about the Taoist critique of the system, one of the things that they would emphasize is that there's an over emphasis or focus on what might be the male side of this yin-yang dichotomy. And we're going to see this kind of play out in this text. But it's not that they're saying it's all one or the other. It's always a both. There's always this balance or this harmony that they're trying to maintain. So they're not saying forget about the male. Go ahead and know about the male, but we need to kind of reassert a little bit more of this female, because this overemphasis on the male side and the different characteristics that come with that is part of what's gotten us into this mess. And so it's a common theme throughout the Tao Te Ching that we see this reassertion of that idea of the female, or the yin side of the yin yang, which comes with all kinds of interesting opposites. You know, they work on these kind of like poles that they're not against each other, they're just complementary to each other. So it's not against each other. So male and female are complementary, and they have different features that are important. And so it's not that anything is ever one or the other. Everything is a mix, just in different proportions. And there's different values that kind of come with each of those. And here, the emphasis is on how do we maintain that female side, bringing in the yin. And again, we've talked about the channel, the idea of the water, how it kind of symbolizes that Tao and becomes a part of. So if we start to then balance this idea of male and female within ourselves, then the consequence of this is we're going to start to mirror in a way what that harmony looks like in our interactions in the world. And so it's saying, becoming this mountain, river, or this stream, we start to model, in a sense, what that looks like. We'll pick up on this a little bit further as well, but I want to kind of play out the rest of this first section, because it kind of comes in three parts. It's going to give us this contrast between the male and the female. Then it's going to give us this imagery, in this case, the channel of the world. And it's going to continue and says, become the channel of the world. And da, remember, the TE is pronounced like da, as in the Daodejing. And it says, and da will endure. So when we're talking about Da, this is the idea of something that is fully expressing the idea of Tao. So Tao for the Taoist is these patterns, a way of life, a way that things function. We can think about them maybe as even like the rules of physics or the laws of nature, and how they engage. And humans are kind of unique in that we have a mental capacity to actually try and go against that we can struggle against, let's say, gravity, right? We can try and ignore it, or we'll not succeed very well at that, but we have the capacity to have that kind of struggle against the inevitable aspect of the way nature functions. And in doing so, we bring about all kinds of pain and suffering on ourselves and on others. So the goal is, how do we get into harmony with that? When we work with those patterns, when we understand how they work, then we can do things like learn how to fly, because we're not working against gravity, we're not fighting it, we're learning how to work with it. So nature, or other creatures, seem to perfectly model that. They just are naturally following all this way of being. And so they exemplify this idea of Da. Da is how Tao is manifest. And so for humans, if we're striving for Da, then it's how do we bring our lives in alignment with this way of being, that's just this natural way of the world. So here it's saying, if we become that channel by balancing this female and male aspects of ourselves, then it's going to say that the Da aspect that we're trying to develop is going to endure. And then it's going to conclude with a final image: return to infancy. So this isn't the first time we've come up with the idea of infancy in our text. Do we have, do you remember what this was referring to last time we talked about it?
I can remember, actually.
Can you
I
be
remember talking about it, but I can't remember what the topic was.
Hmm. Dane, were you going to say something?
Can you be as soft and supple as a babe?
Mm-hmm. And what is, that's how it was talked about previously. What do you think they were trying to get at with that idea?
Conceived notions, no prejudgments.
Supple is the companion of life, the stiff and rigid is the companion of death.
Yes, I love that version or that verse that comes up later. Sorry, Martin, you were starting to say something?
Sorry, the lack of preconceived notions, lack of the biases and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's kind of before culture has its way with us, right? So a baby is it doesn't know language yet, which is another thing that the Taoists are concerned about, because it comes with a lot of ambiguity in terms of how language works. It also tends to limit our way of seeing things based on, the different ways that it shapes the way we see our world, along with the different cultural aspects of the values that are imposed and the goals that we're supposed to achieve. So when we think about an infant, we're thinking about a person that is still in that natural state. It just does things naturally, which would be very much in keeping or manifesting this idea of Da. So this is kind of held up as an example of what a human can be like before it has been shaped by culture. And the goal is not to get back to a point where we don't actually have language and we don't have any way of, engaging with the world or being completely helpless like an infant. It's more of recognizing what got added onto that, what got added onto myself from when I was just naturally kind of here in the world that has shaped me in different ways. It's now affecting the way I see the world. It's becoming aware of those changes so that we can hopefully get past those biases or those ways of looking at the world that we have adopted that maybe we don't normally question, but we need to, because there's other things going on that we're going to miss if we're got these blinders on, or if we're looking through different filters of, lenses of looking at the world. So returning to this idea of infancy is not to become infantile, but to recognize what's been added on and work at how do we get back to more of that direct experience of reality, so that then we can evaluate based on more of a true experience as opposed to what's been a constructed experience. So one of those ways that we do that is we recognize that male and female are not they're not opposed. Everything is a mix of those, and we need to keep them in balance. We're currently, according to the Daodejing, dealing with an overemphasis on the yang. So there's more of this male, more of this control, more of this structure. Whereas if we can reassert more of the yin, then we're bringing in more of this openness to newness, the idea of chaos in the sense of novelty, that is our ability to be present in a way to experience without feeling like we need to control or shape or manage it. This would be some of the ideas that are coming into play. And then again, with that mountain river, then picking up on the metaphors of how the water works in the Tao Te Ching, it flows where it naturally goes, and it doesn't fight with anything. It just goes around things or over things. And even though it's soft and supple, it can still actually wear away great, powerful things like stone. So it's got a lot of interesting metaphors that come into play with that. So there's going to be 3 of these sections where it's going to bring up a set of opposites, and then how does it play out? So our next, And I just wanted to, real quick, before we go on to the next one, just kind of rehearse visually what we're thinking about here with this kind of like this Taoist way of looking at the world. So even though these are presented as layers, remember these are kind of all of a thing. We're just intentionally separating aspects of it to facilitate the discussion and also help us to understand how they relate. So Tao, again, is this idea of the patterns of things, how things function, the way of things in the universe. We could think of it like the natural laws. And within that, then we have two, I guess we could say opposites again, absence and presence. And absence is this idea of not emptiness, not void, but without form. It's essentially the substance from which everything emerges and goes back to, but it isn't experienced as anything by us. It's experienced as an emptiness, but it's not, in fact, actually empty. It's also sometimes referred to as chi. Then the presence would be with form. So whatever we want to think about this idea of absence, how it then manifests then within form would be now all the things that we experience in life. And again, the colorful way they talk about this is the 10,000 things. But it's always going through these cycles of coming from absence to presence and then from presence back to absence. Things seem to come into existence and then seem to go out of existence. But again, we don't want to think of out of existence as not existing at all. It's just going back to more of a formless state, kind of how we could think about atoms make up everything that we see, but we don't see atoms themselves. And things are constantly being configured in such a way that they appear to be here to us, and then they appear to go away, but really all the atoms that make up that thing are still around. They're just configured in different ways that we can no longer perceive. So this would be a very core aspect of the worldview that they're dealing with in thinking through these concepts. And once we get into the realm of presence, then this is where we have that yin-yang concept of, that male, female, that light, the dark, the control, the chaos, how these things kind of interact with each other, and recognizing those patterns of how they interact and bringing our lives into harmony with that in terms of balancing that yin yang, but also recognizing that overall movement from absence to presence and back again, which means that everything is in change. Everything is constantly moving from one thing to the other, which is what we see with that yin yang, is they are not static. It's evolving. The yin is turning into the yang, and the yang is turning into the yin. And they have a little bit of each of the opposite in each other with that little dot in the center of each one. So that's just kind of some big pictures way we can think about kind of this thought world that this language is happening within. So then if we go to the next one, we can see here again where some of this yin yang is coming into play. Know the white, sustain the black. So again, we have the white is associated with the male and the black is associated with the female. So we've got the yin and the yang. Again, we have this idea, yes, know the white, but in this case, instead of maintain, it says sustain the black. How do we kind of bring that more back into the picture? It's a little bit light right now because we've got an overemphasis on what's happening in that culture that is disruptive. So we need to bring that yin element back in. And so then the imagery with this is when we start to bring this harmony together is becoming the pattern of the world. So if we think about what we were just looking at, if our lives are kind of matching those same kind of patterns in terms of how we approach and how we interpret the world, then we become a pattern that's reflective. Another thing that is a common metaphor we see is this idea of a mirror without any without any smudges, without any dust, right? That it becomes clear, and it refers to it often as the dark mirror. So it's this way that we are able to accurately reflect what's in the world without imposing the filters and the different lenses on top of that. It's more of an accurate way of seeing it. And so this is what happens then with that pattern, is when we have that accurate understanding, when we're seeing clearly, then we have the ability to actually live that out and becoming that pattern. And so here it says then, when you become that pattern of the world, it says, and Da will not falter. So again, this emphasis on what's going to happen with developing the manifestation of Tao in our life. This idea of Da is that it's not going to falter. And then the final imagery, again, is this idea, well, it says here, to return to the uncarved block, which we're going to break this out a little bit, because this is, again, it's not technically uncarved block, it's uncarved wood or unaltered wood. And because obviously a block is already carved. So it's a little bit of an unfortunate translation that's kind of stuck around. Some of the newer ones go back to this idea of unaltered or uncarved wood. But what's interesting here, and this is where I'd really like to get into the mind of some of the different translators, is this is a completely different word for what is normally translated as uncarved block. And it's this Chinese characters of Wu Ji. And Wu, we're familiar with. This is that idea again of absence. So if we think about, absence and presence, Wu is absence. And then Ji is the same character is used with something like Tai Chi. It's often pronounced like Tai Chi, and it looks like CHI sometimes in English spelling, but in modern Pinyin English romanization of Chinese characters, it's JI. So Wu Ji then is a way of saying so Ji is like the ultimate, right? So Tai Chi is a way of saying like the great ultimate. Wu Ji is like saying the ultimate absence, the great absence. So one of the ways it gets translated is the origin of everything. So if we think about absence and presence and how things move from absence into presence and then ultimately back again, this translation, I think, makes a little bit more sense. So instead of saying returning to the uncarved block, it's more this idea of returning to that origin of everything, being connected with, understanding and perceiving the world in this absence and presence perspective, and how everything really ends up being one thing, just in different manifestations that we perceive as being in and out of existence, but really it's all just one thing configured in different ways. So returning to that idea of that origin of everything is recognizing that oneness, and how do we become a part of that? So if we back this up then a little bit, that the white and the black, again, that balance, we are recognizing that these aren't at odds with one another. They complement each other, but they need to be in the right balance. And maybe we've got an overemphasis on that white, the yang side. And so we're going to reassert more of the yin, the black or the dark side. And in doing so, we start to reflect more clearly the ways of, or the patterns of this world in our own lives. We become that pattern of the world. And in doing so, then our Da will not falter. And when we're looking at it from that perspective, then it's a return to that origin of everything, as opposed to this idea of uncarved block. Again, I don't know why this particular translator chose to translate this as uncarved block here. Specifically strange, because in the next section, they're actually going to use the word for uncarved block, and they translated it as something different. So go figure. We'll figure it out. So no honor sustained disgrace. Now, I think what's happening with this translation is they're trying to look at how can we translate this a little bit more in terms of like really seeming like opposites in terms of honor and disgrace, or it could be honor and shame, or it could be even more something along the lines of like confidence and humility would be another valid way of looking at how these things are kind of played out, or being recognized and being humble. Could be a way you look at that. So we a little bit not happy with the disgrace part here, because if we're lining up the two different columns, we would have male, white, and honor. And if the other side then is female, black, and disgrace, that's not really good. But if it's this idea of humility or humbleness, then that fits in really nicely, because they're both positive things. They're just different angles on the thing that we're trying to bring into balance. So we need to hold these things together the same as we're looking at the others, but maybe we're needing to emphasize a little bit more of that humility, that humbleness. And here, Dan, we come back to the idea of the valley. So in doing this, it's bringing up that idea of the valley of the world. And to recall, and this isn't just for Dane, but for any of the people that were part of the prior discussions, what was the symbolism we were seeing with the valley? How is the valley something that was being lifted up as an example?
Can you say that again?
So in the past, we were talking about the spirit of the valley, and that became kind of this powerful image that they were using about Tao. And there are aspects of the valley that were being held up, excuse me, as kind of examples for us. What were some of those examples? How is it a powerful symbol for the Taoist?
If I remember correctly, it was talking about how the valley has a lot of abundance because it collects the downfall from the mountains.
And why is it a place of gathering?
Because it's not trying to be a mountain. It's not trying to be the tallest, coolest thing.
Well, I mean, we could think even just
draws things to it because it's beneath them.
Yes, it's just physically the shape, right? It's low, it's beneath, and because of that, things flow, in particular, water flow to it, and it becomes a place then of sustenance, a place where life happens. And this would again be one of the ways, and we might get into some of the discussions about culturally how things have evolved, but definitely at the time when this is being written, one of the ways that they would identify the woman, especially, and they bring in a lot of kind of sexual metaphors with this, is to be beneath, and that in that lower position she's actually able to, in a sense, kind of conquer or tame the man by being passive and being below. And so it's another way that they kind of tie in that valley about it being passive and low, but it draws all things to it, and in doing so it becomes fruitful. It's a place of growth. And the same way that and this is one of the key aspects with the idea of the feminine within the Tao, is it's hearkening back to more of this Paleolithic perspective of seeing the world from this idea of its generative aspects and kind of the miracle of life and how it generates plants and animals, and how within the humans, and of course with other animals, that the female does the same thing, that it generates new life. And so there was much more of an emphasis on this idea of the feminine as kind of the guiding metaphor for thinking about the experience of life, as opposed to when we move more into the agricultural age. Now all of a sudden the dynamics shift, because what's essential is not recognizing how does life happen, where do we find the food, where do we find the animals in our kind of hunter-gatherer nomadic stage, but we become settled and we focus on a particular piece of land that then we need to protect, because now we're thinking of it in terms of our own. And so more of the masculine features come into play in terms of that protection and that control. And so we have a shift from what initially were like these personifications in feminine form of goddesses or different ways that they were kind of looking at the world, to more masculine oriented things that were honoring things like war and power and strength. So the valley being low, being passive, it's not this idea of conquering. It's this idea that life is generative and that we need to tie into that way of looking at the world, as opposed to the idea of nature being something that needs to be conquered and controlled, but it becomes more this gift of abundance that we need to move in harmony with and learn how to nurture, as opposed to just treating it like a resource. So if we do that, it says then again, this idea of fully embracing or modeling this idea of those patterns of the world will prevail. And the final imagery then is to return to simplicity. Now here is where we actually have the word for uncarved wood. So it definitely becomes the character for talking about simplicity. But when we're using these metaphors of like uncarved wood, it's this word pu. I think that's how you pronounce it. And so it's not wrong to translate it as simplicity, but it was very strange that they took, again, this wu ji, this idea of that great absence, and translated that as uncarved wood. And then here, where it would normally be translated, they translated it as simplicity. So just keep it in mind that at the conclusion of this point, when it's talking about that great and humble, holding that balance, that it's then kind of looking at, again, the valley is another thing that becomes manifest in our lives, especially when we think about, trying to have that virtue of being that reflection of how the world works. And it leads to this idea of simplicity. It's this idea of that uncarved wood. So when we get there, we need to think about, again, the infant. So we had a couple of different things. We had the infant, which is how do we get back to that state before we've been, I'm sure the Taoists would use much more kind of strong language in the sense of like becoming adulterated by, the way that culture has shaped us. This uncarved wood is getting at that same idea. When the wood is carved, it's taking something that was natural and it's trying to shape it into something unnatural. And if we're thinking about it in terms of people, we're getting back to this idea of how is this larger culture carving us up to get us to fit into their pattern. That's maybe not that natural pattern. It's not the way that we are naturally. And for the Taoists, they would say, when you do that, when you start defining these strict hierarchies and these stations in life, and this is where you're supposed to fit, and we need to carve you up in our education program to get you to be that square peg and to fit in that square slot, as opposed to whatever you happen to be just kind of in the wild, that contortion, that attempt at controlling people and carving them up in a certain way is where this hostility comes from. That there's the resistance to that because it's not the natural state that humans want to be in. And so here we're getting back at this idea of returning to that uncarved wood state, recognizing of how we've been shaped and hacked by culture to be a certain thing that's maybe not who we are, and maybe it's a benefit for somebody else, but it's not a benefit necessarily to us. So we have to recognize how those things have been implemented. How do we try to find our way back to what does this more kind of natural existence in the world look like? So after these, and maybe I'll pause there for a second, and any thoughts about this last one of this balance between honor and humility?
yeah, I'm just having a really hard. Like, I think this is like the 3 levels above your day-to-day when you aligning with your life strategy, your vision, your how do you want to your bigger plans.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just lacking some of the guidance from this on how to do the daily, how to incorporate these decisions into your daily life, and what things to do to pay your bills and stuff like that.
Yeah. So let's do this. After there's one part left, that's kind of like the therefore portion of this. After that, let's return back to that, Martin, and kind of tease out how some of these ideas can start to have an impact in terms of our day-to-day life. And in particular, because the Taoists were having to wrestle with the same thing. They were living in a culture that was not seeing the world the way that they did. And so if we're trying to look at these concepts and how might this be helpful for me in my current context, it's not because this is the way that the wider world around us looks at things. It's exactly the opposite. It definitely would be much more in line with the world that the Taoists are actually critiquing. So it's interesting that we find ourselves in a similar place that this text originated in, and so we will have some thoughts on that. Well, let's just look at how this then concludes. And this is very unhappy with the conclusion of this, the way it was translated, but I will tell you that this was very widely translated. This last part is where you would have the most like diverse views of how to translate it, and we'll see if we can kind of pull some of this out. So we'll start with the one that's the translation that we've been going through, which is the Addiss and Lombardo. And I know I've been kind of, ragging on this translation a bit, but overall, I really do appreciate their translations. It's just sometimes you get to some passages and all translators have some type of way of looking at things. I don't want to say necessarily an agenda, but it's definitely an overall impression that they are trying to express in the way they translate things. And I'm not exactly sure what their goal was on this one to make some of the different translation choices that they did. But it just happened to not line up exactly with my overall view of things. Somebody else might find this exactly spot on. So again, you're getting my take on this coming from a very specifically naturalist perspective. So it concludes then by saying simplicity, and this is still that word pu, so we can look at this as that uncarved wood, and it makes a lot more sense here. Simplicity divided becomes utensils, right? So the wood, you split it up and you make stuff out of it. You make tools. And this, what's that?
Chopsticks, right? Utensils.
Chopsticks, yeah. Could be chopsticks. It could be who knows what, cups, bowls, anything, right? But what's interesting is that utensils is could also be translated as tools, becomes a metaphorical way of talking about low-level government employees or public servants of some kind, which is kind of interesting because we use kind of similar language in for ourselves, where we'll talk about somebody who's maybe, well, what comes to mind when you think about calling somebody a tool, right? We have that as a phrase that we use to kind of personify a certain type of behavior that people are showing. And evidently they had kind of a similar idea of referring to certain kinds of people as tools. And we get back to that idea of that uncarved wood and being carved into something to fit a particular utility. Then we get to some really interesting thoughts, right? Because now if we're talking about government, which completely comes into play over and over with the Daodejing, because it's offering a solution to this warring states period, right? So it's definitely going to get into the political side of things. Here we've got this idea then of individuals being carved up in such a way that they become a utility that can be used and also be called a tool. That are then so and here's where it gets really weird in this particular translation, because it's saying, okay, yep, that simplicity instead of uncarved wood divided becomes utensils. They say here that are used by the sage as high official. Not super clear how they were going with this, because sage is within the Daodejing is somebody who's properly modeling this idea of Tao. So why is it that these utensils then are then used by the sage as high official? I mean, we could wrestle with that in a couple of different ways, but I'll get to a different translation where I think brings this out a little bit better. But here it's definitely a little bit confusing. I think where they were going with it is that in spite of things being divided and split up, that the sage, if he was in the position of authority, so maybe the sage should be, the king or the emperor, kind of like Plato with the idea of the philosophical kings, right? That they could take these tools and then use them properly. And we see that brought out in this last line that says, but great governing does not carve up. And I like the way it's tying this in at the end, because it's definitely getting to, if we're thinking about that uncarved wood and we're thinking about the problem of people being forced into slots or being made into tools or being treated as utilities, then here they're saying from that sage perspective, it's not about carving up. One of them says, does not hack, which is another kind of interesting way to look at that. But I want to bring in another translation of this last little paragraph here that I think does a much better job of bringing out the features that we've been talking about. And it's representative of a number of different translations that go down that road, that I think are a little bit more clear. So here they're actually using uncarved block as opposed to simplicity. So it says, when the uncarved block is cut up, then it becomes a government tool, right? So this idea of utility, of being equated with people, government tool. When the wise person, and this is how they translate the word for sage, instead uses it, then it becomes the head of government. So it's the uncarved block is the reference here. So government's taking that uncarved block and it's carving it up into the different utensils, into the tools, into the utility. Here it's saying that the wise person, the sage, instead, it becomes the head of the government, and the idea that it's not disrupted, it's not broken up. He says, yes, a great carver does no cutting. Now, it seems like he's adding an additional line here, but what's happened is that the term for carver and the term for ruler are both contained in that single character. So there's kind of this double entendre that's intended in the original language that in order to bring that out into English required you to kind of restate it twice, one as carver and one as ruler. So that's why there's kind of this doubling up here to bring out those two different ideas. So the great carver does no cutting. In the same way, we could say a great ruler makes no rules. That's kind of fascinating. So we definitely could look at this as something that's much more kind of, laissez-faire, libertarian kind of a thing. But it's interesting how it kind of brings this all together, that there's this diversity, and it's not making the claim that the male or the female is the correct, that the white or the black is correct, or, the honor and the humility are correct. It's both. and they need to work together, and there's maybe a little bit more of an emphasis on that yin side to bring in more of that comfortableness with that novelty, that comfortableness with not knowing, that comfortableness with being more passive in the sense of not trying to control everything, right? So all those things come into play when they're thinking about what would the ideal ruler look like. It's going to be someone who's not trying to take people and turn them into tools, not going to carve them up to fit a certain pattern that is useful for whoever happens to be in charge. It's going to recognize that value of the infant, of the great ultimate, in terms of that everything comes from that absence, and it's going to bring in that idea of that uncarved wood, getting back to that again, that recognition of the natural state of things as the ideal state. And so that how that gets manifest then in terms of management or rulership is, it's about how do we work on, I think the way we could talk about this is the difference between harmony and conformity. So with conformity, this is where the hacking happens. This is where the cutting happens to get everything to line up and be the same. But with harmony, it's recognizing the value of the differences and finding ways to blend them together in such a way that it makes something bigger out of the whole than just the parts. And maybe that's the way we could look at what's happening with this ideal sage in this last part in terms of how it goes about doing ruling. So that would conclude our chapter. I want to get back to Martin's questions about how would some of this come into play. But just before we do that, I want to see if there's any thoughts about this one as a whole now that we've had a chance to go through it.
I've always found the semantics of the word employee interesting. Because one of the meanings of the word employ, I mean, like one of the most common meanings, it means to use. So like you can employ a person, like hire them to do a job, or you can employ a tactic, or you can employ a tool, or I mean, employ, one of the meanings of employ is to use. So an employee is one who is used, or AKA a tool. And an employer is one who uses other people, AKA a user. This seems to kind of parallel that.
It becomes kind of interesting when you start to break this stuff down. And this is what I just love about going through this ancient text, is it really just shakes things up a bit and gets you to like, oh, there's a lot of stuff in these social arrangements that we don't normally think about, that when we do, cause us to question a lot of things.
One of the things that I have been thinking about from the very start of this session is what's going on in the world in terms of the treatment of women and the disregard, and think about so much of the philosophy of a lot of the terrorists, that there's just a complete disregard for everything that is being put out here. And it seems to me that this is a great philosophy. If only it could be adopted today, it could change a lot.
Yeah, it definitely brings a lot of balance between the sexes and how we think about society and what is valued versus what is not valued. Yeah. So, Martin, I'm curious, after we had a chance to go through the whole chapter, did the conclusion help to bring in any ideas for application, or is this something you want to explore further?
To be honest, not really. I mean, again, it's very high level, very vision, very how shall we? But and I think there is, as we just like we've explored within our organization, like you have to start at the top. You have to have a vision. You have to have a some value system. You have to have some ideology you want to kind of align with, and then break it down into, well, this is what it's going to mean. This is what my milestones or goals are going to be that are aligning with those values. And then I'm going to break down some individual milestones and goals to individual steps on how I'm going to get there. But when faced with, as Trit just said, when faced with the daily choices, decisions, you can always keep in mind and say, hey, I want to make the choice the best that best gets me to the goal. But the reality oftentimes is just like, I can't quite do that. I would love to be this way, but I can't because I need to pay bills, or I need to remain healthy, or I need to remain safe. So I'm still kind of struggling to find that
Yeah.
guide, I guess.
And it's tough. And there's another guy that comes to our in-person class that is frequently frustrated by a similar aspect, that it tends to approach things in more of a higher level of saying, these are some general themes. I like to think of it more in terms of, it gives us a methodology, but it's not giving us the specific answers. And I think there's a lot of value to that, because then it's not about, here's the specific thing that you should do. It's more, if we're going to try and just understand the different mechanisms of how the world works and how humans are working in that world, then it gives us more clarity into what's happening so that we can then make decisions. It's not telling us what those decisions are. And to me, that becomes much more useful and becomes much more across time and generations and cultures. It becomes useful still if it were to prescribe certain solutions that applied, to the, 5th century BC ancient China, we would not find it at all helpful. So where it comes for us is, I think, when we have to take on, or if we take seriously this idea of that humility, and in general, I think what we pick up with a lot of the Taoist text is, we need to recognize that we don't know everything about anything. That there has to be this constant humility, that we're constantly learning. We never have all the information, and we can never be 100% confident. Nonetheless, we still need to take action. So in doing so, we have to do it in such a way that there's certain actions that you would take one direction versus another. If you're totally confident this is 100% correct and I know all the information, you might feel justified in making some pretty extreme decisions in terms of things that were going to radically affect other people, or maybe even their lives, because we have that level of confidence. If we don't have that level of confidence, if we recognize that we don't know everything, then we're going to be more cautious with the kind of decisions that we make, and we're going to evaluate the consequences of that. We're going to evaluate how it's unfolding and be open to adjusting our plans accordingly. That would be one thing, is recognizing that we don't have the kind of confidence needed to make certain types of decisions that have certain types of impact. But the other thing would be, how we maintain our personal way of being inside certain structures. So you and I, Martin, work in a corporate structure that is definitely got levels and ranks that, promotions are considered good things. And with that comes, more flexibility, but also more responsibility, but also more pay that helps with, how do we get things done in our lives, take care of the bills, as you say. But yet Daodejing is saying things like, be careful about things like promotion, because if you buy into the idea of promotion, that means that you're viewed as a subordinate. And that's not good, because we're all just people. So part of how we would translate that to ourselves is not getting a big head about something, not getting overinflated. Oh, now I'm up here and I can start treating people down there the way I used to be treated. You shift that whole thing where you start to address and treat people as equals, whether they're above you or below you. And that has a way of manifesting that's still within this corporate hierarchical structure, but you treat people differently. And honestly, I think that when we have the ability to treat people in a certain way, then that's contagious. It draws people to us, kind of like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. When somebody is really present and really accepting, it draws people because they so often are not seen, they're so often not felt, and because of that, they want to have more of that in their life. And so there's a whole different way that we can engage even within that hierarchical structure that's maybe contrary to what we think is correct, but yet we still have to exist within it because we don't have any other option. How we do that is going to be the key. And I know that's probably not giving you still super specific things, but I'm just trying to flesh out how some of this might work.
Yeah, I totally understand what you mean. I guess I'm just still on my journey to make it happen and apply.
Yeah, it's a never-ending journey.
But thank you for elaborating on that. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to need to bring this to a close for today. So I want to thank you for joining us. And if you are watching this video and you'd like to be a part of our live Zoom discussions, or if you're in the Southern California area and like to join us in person, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and we'll get the information out to you, and we'd love to see you then. All right. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Jim.